Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure today to introduce Hayley Webster. Hayley is a graduate from the University of Alberta with a Bachelor of Science in Environmental and Conservation Sciences. She has held some recent positions, including one with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada as a policy analyst, and we're very pleased to have Hayley reporting on her adaptation and resilience training, a work that she has been very busy with over the past 9 months. So in October, Hayley also joined me, Nevin Rizasson, in the field and completed some vegetation identification surrounding our wetlands that we're currently monitoring under another project. Hayley, while not a pulse grower, is a pulse consumer. She loves chickpeas, dal, and chili as a few of her staple go-to meals. And I would urge you all to welcome Hayley using the heart icon at the bottom of the screen. We will also be using the question function during today's webinar, and Hayley will be taking questions throughout and will address these questions at the end of her presentation. So without further ado, again, I welcome you to a flood of facts on the benefits of wetlands on the agricultural landscape, and very excited to hear Hayley's presentation today. So I will turn it over to you, Hayley, and we're very eagerly awaiting to hear some of the information and research that you've undertaken over the past time with Alberta Pulse Growers. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, Nevin, and thank you everyone for joining today's webinar on beneficial agricultural wetland stewardship. So I'm going to start the webinar with a land acknowledgement. I am presenting from Edmonton, which is located within Treaty 6 territory and within the Métis homeland and the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 4. I acknowledge that this land as the traditional territories of many First Nations, including the Cree, Dean, Stoney, Saulteaux, and Blackfoot. And I know that many people are tuning into this webinar from different locations, and I encourage everyone to take a moment and reflect on the traditional territory that you are currently residing on and acknowledge the many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit who have lived, cared, and shaped these lands. So during this webinar, I'm going to share some of the ecological and agricultural benefits of wetlands, as well as how to manage agricultural wetlands in order to get some of these benefits. And so I'll begin with a bit of an introduction on what wetlands are, and then I'll be talking about 4 main areas of ecological services that wetlands provide. So those will be carbon sequestration, water regulation, water filtration, biodiversity, and then I'll wrap it up with a brief summary. As Nevin mentioned, if you have questions, you can put them into your chat or question box by typing them. And at the end, I think this will go for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So to begin with the introduction on what are wetlands, the Government of Alberta's definition for wetlands is land that is saturated with water for long enough to promote the formation of water-altered soils and the growth of water-tolerant vegetation. So wetlands don't need to have water present to be considered wetlands, as you can see from this definition. And this is important to remember because this means that wetland policies and management considerations are still relevant to wetlands even when they're dry and have no water. So on the bottom left of the screen, you can see some characteristic wetland soils that have they're quite gray from the iron, and then in the middle there's some characteristic wetland vegetation. So these are kind of just common things that if wetlands have water or not, that you will see on land that is considered a wetland. And so here are some more pictures of wetlands. Wetlands is a broad description that applies to many different unique ecosystems. And so all 4 of these pictures are different types of wetlands. In the top left corner, there's a picture of a fen. So this would be a peatland wetland, and these are very common across northern Alberta. And then these other 3 pictures are of marshes and prairie potholes. So in the top right, we have a marsh, below that, a smaller prairie pothole. And then here on the bottom left, we have a dried out marsh. And so in this webinar, when I'm talking about wetlands, I'm going to be referring to these mineral wetlands, so these marshes and these prairie potholes that are found throughout southern and central Alberta, because this is where a lot of agriculture is concentrated in Alberta. So the prairie wetlands that I'm going to be discussing in this webinar and the agricultural sector of Alberta is largely encompassed within what is called the prairie pothole region. So this map shows the prairie pothole region outlined in the light and the dark gray, and you can see that it expands from southern to central Alberta into Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and it also goes into the States a bit. And so the prairie pothole region was formed by glaciation. And as glaciers moved across this region during the last ice age, mounds of ice fell off the glaciers and they melted, forming depressions across the landscape. And today these depressions have filled up with water, and this is what we call our prairie potholes and our wetlands that are characteristic of this region. And while these glaciers formed lots of wetlands, they also deposited lots of mineral and organic material that created very fertile soils. And so not only is this region known for its characteristic wetlands, but also for having very fertile soil. And because of the fertile soil, this region is primarily used for agriculture today. So the government of Alberta estimates that approximately 60 to 70% of wetlands have been lost from Alberta's prairie pothole region as the result of land use change. And so this is primarily agriculture, but also urbanization and other resource development contributes to this. And so as you can imagine, this fertile soil that really draws in agriculture and land development often comes with converting the land, which often includes draining wetlands and transforming it. And you can see on the right of the screen, there's kind of like the classic prairie pothole landscape with lots of depressions. And you can see how when you're converting that into agriculture, the landscape looks a lot different. And this is important to consider because this means that as little as 30% of historical wetlands remain in the prairie pothole region. And as you can see, all this water that used to be stored in the landscape, if it's being drained, it has to go somewhere else. And so losing these wetlands has huge implications for watersheds across this landscape. So with regards to agriculture, wetlands are typically viewed as opportunity costs. And this is because the presence of wetlands reduces the total area that can be used for production. As well, wetlands are further another opportunity cost because operating farm machinery around wetlands imposes additional costs for production. And so for these reasons, wetland drainage is a common agricultural practice. However, wetlands also provide ecological services, and these ecological services have environmental benefits as well as agricultural benefits. And so in the next sections, I'm going to talk about the environmental and agricultural benefits from carbon sequestration, water regulation, water filtration, and wildlife habitat that are provided by wetlands. So the first ecological service I'm going to discuss is carbon sequestration. Wetlands are known for their ability to sequester and store atmospheric carbon. And this has very important implications for climate change. Carbon sequestration is a huge topic right now, and in this section I will get into how wetlands achieve this. However, wetlands are also known for their role in emitting greenhouse gases. There's a lot of criticism surrounding wetland greenhouse gas emissions, particularly that of methane. So I will also kind of go into how wetlands produce greenhouse gases, and it's not just methane, they also produce carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide. And then ultimately, I will go into how wetland conservation and restoration can offset greenhouse gas emissions through carbon sequestration. So wetlands are very important carbon sinks across prairie landscapes. They are one of the most productive types of terrestrial ecosystems, and this means that they produce a lot of vegetation, and in building up vegetation, they store carbon and plant biomass. Wetlands are also anaerobic, and this means that plant decomposition is limited. And so instead of decomposing, wetlands incorporate plants into the soil, and the carbon from plants gets stored as soil organic carbon. And so because wetlands are the most productive type of terrestrial ecosystem and because they're anaerobic, they are able to sequester and store significant amounts of carbon in both vegetation and soil. And studies have shown that wetlands sequester carbon at a faster rate than no-till agriculture while taking up much smaller areas of land. And this is important to consider because policy currently recognizes no-till agriculture as a practice for maintaining soil carbon levels. And so this means that there is room to potentially implement policy that also recognizes wetlands for the carbon sequestration that they carry out. And so ultimately, when you restore wetlands, you are increasing carbon storage in prairie landscapes. And by conserving the wetlands that are present on your land, you're maintaining these carbon stores in the prairie landscape. So now on to greenhouse gas emissions. One of the big ones that people always are critical of wetlands for is their methane emissions. So wetlands produce methane as a part of the carbon cycle, and methane is produced by microbes in the soil. However, wetland methane production is extremely variable and very dependent on ever-changing environmental conditions. So some of the conditions that would facilitate methane production are high permanent water tables. And so this is referring to semi-permanent or permanent wetlands that are present throughout the year and generally stay saturated for long periods of time. In order for microbes to produce methane, they require anaerobic environments. And so when you have these permanent wetlands that are inundated for long periods of time, it creates these conditions that microbes can use and produce methane. Warm temperatures also increase methane emissions. And again, this is because the microbes prefer warmer environments. So early in the spring, you might have a lot of water from snow melt and runoff, but it'll be a bit cool. And so towards later spring and summer, as temperatures warm, it's likely that you'll begin to see increases in methane emissions from wetlands. And then the last condition that's important to note is the absence of sulfates. So sulfate or salts that are present in water actually inhibit methane production. And in Alberta, a lot of groundwater has high salinity content. And so this is interesting to note because if you have a wetland that's being fed groundwater that's high in salinity, this can actually suppress methane emissions by limiting the ability of microbes to produce methane. So there's kind of two pictures of wetlands at the bottom of the screen. And just in a general sense, if you look at the wetland on the left, it's a small prairie pothole, not very big. It's probably likely to fill up with water in the spring and maybe dry out later in the summer. And if you were to compare that to this wetland on the right, that's a much larger, a permanent marsh that's likely to stay saturated for a long period of time. So you would expect the wetland on the right that's more permanent with a higher water table to have higher methane emissions than the wetland on the left that's likely to wet and dry a lot more frequently on a shorter cycle. But again, every single wetland is unique, so it's kind of the takeaway from this is that it's really difficult to look at a wetland and say this wetland is going to produce this amount of methane because it can change throughout the season and is very dependent for each wetland. So now for carbon dioxide emissions. Carbon dioxide is one of the most talked about greenhouse gases. And so if you were to measure all of the gases produced by wetlands, you would notice that carbon dioxide is being emitted. However, this isn't a huge concern with regards to climate change because it's a natural ecosystem process that's carried out by all ecosystems. It's actually the wetlands that produce carbon dioxide during their respiration. And so as you have more plants that are highly productive and are growing very densely, you will see more carbon emissions associated with plant respiration. And this is just a natural part of plant growth. If you look at the bottom, the wetland on the left kind of has dying off vegetation. Maybe it's early in the spring or late in fall, and not much is growing, so there wouldn't be a lot of carbon dioxide produced compared to the wetland on the right that has a lot of dense vegetation that looks highly productive. And so because this vegetation is growing, it's going to be producing carbon dioxide. And then the last greenhouse gas I'm going to talk about is nitrous oxide. So nitrous oxide is not a part of the carbon cycle. It's actually produced as a part of the nitrogen cycle, but it's still an important greenhouse gas, so I'm going to mention it in this section. And so conditions that facilitate nitrous oxide production are almost the opposite of what facilitates methane production. So you'll see greater amounts of nitrous oxide produced when you have wetlands that have highly fluctuating water tables. And this is because the denitrification and nitrification processes that produce nitrous oxide work best in semi-saturated conditions. So when you have a water-filled pore space of around 60%. And so ephemeral wetlands are expected generally to produce more nitrous oxide because they're likely to kind of fill up with water if it's early in spring or if there's a rainfall, and then as weather and temperatures increase, kind of quickly dry out. And that constant change of filling up with water with just any kind of small snow melt to runoff event and then drying out quickly creates semi-saturated conditions that are good for nitrous oxide emissions. And then as well, inputs of fertilizer will increase nitrous oxide emissions. And this is because it's kind of a source of nitrogen that the microbes can use for nitrous oxide production. And on an agricultural landscape, of course, lots of fertilizer is being used. And so as fertilizer is carried to wetlands via runoff, this can increase the nitrous oxide emissions. So wetlands both sequester carbon, but they also emit different greenhouse gases. And so one of the big questions is, are wetlands carbon sinks or carbon sources? And so even though wetlands do produce greenhouse gases, they are generally carbon sinks, but every single wetland is unique. And so a wetland can be both a carbon sink and a carbon source depending on the time of year that you look at it. So if you look at a wetland, maybe in the spring and it's an ephemeral wetland and it's emitting large amounts of nitrous oxide, the nitrous oxide emissions may exceed the amount of carbon it's sequestering at that point in time. However, you kind of have to look at wetlands on a bit of a larger picture and look at them over a longer period of time to kind of fully understand how their carbon sequestration potential relates to the greenhouse gases they produce. And so even though some wetlands may permanently be carbon sources and some are permanent carbon sinks and some fluctuate, a lot of studies show that over time, wetlands are generally as a whole carbon sinks. And by increasing wetlands across prairie landscapes, that significantly increases carbon storage. So ultimately, wetlands are carbon sinks. And so the environmental benefits of wetlands is that they can mitigate the progression of climate change by sequestering and storing carbon. And then the agricultural benefits is that wetlands can offset agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. And this is just important to consider because this means that there's potential for implementation of policy that will compensate landowners for wetland carbon storage. For stewardship recommendations, the first one that's pretty straightforward is to conserve and restore wetlands. So again, when you conserve them, you're keeping the soil that's been stored in the ground, not in the atmosphere. And when you restore wetlands, you are increasing carbon storage. It's also recommended to not crop wetlands even when they are dry. So when you kind of till up the soil or expose the soil to the air, all the carbon that's stored in the soil becomes exposed to the atmosphere and a lot of carbon escapes. And so it's really important that even when there's not water in wetlands to not crop them so that the carbon stores remain in the ground. It's also recommended to maintain a vegetative buffer strip around wetlands composed of diverse native vegetation. And so what this does is it helps prevent nitrogen from entering wetlands and turning into nitrous oxide emissions, which I'll talk about a bit more in depth later on in the presentation. And then of course, avoiding excess fertilizer use. I know no one wants to put on more fertilizer than they need because that can be very expensive. But of course, just keeping in mind that if there is excess fertilizer use that's not being taken up by crops, it can contribute to nitrous oxide emissions. So the next ecological service that I'm going to talk about is water regulation. As climate change progresses, floods and drought events are expected to increase in frequency and intensity, and both too much and not enough water pose challenges for crop production. So wetlands are able to buffer the effects of both floods and droughts, which can have a lot of benefits for climate change and the impacts of climate change on agriculture. So first I'll talk about floods. Wetlands are able to collect and store water, and they ultimately increase water storage on a landscape. By increasing water storage on a landscape, wetlands reduce the severity of flooding as well as the cost of flood damages. So the Intact Center on Climate Change Adaptation at the University of Waterloo did a study kind of trying to quantify or put like a cost value on the benefits of wetlands with regards to flooding. And they found that intact wetlands reduce the financial cost of floods by 29% on agricultural landscapes. So this is huge, and especially floods are pretty much, they can be very unexpected, and once they happen, you can't really prevent them, and the damages can be very, very expensive. And so having wetlands on your landscape can really work to, when these events do occur, save you money from the damages that will result from it. In this picture in the bottom, I'll show it at different times throughout the presentation, but I just think it's a good image that shows how these different wetlands do collect and store water across the landscape. And you can imagine if, for example, you were to take away any one of these wetlands and drain it, all the water that's stored in it is going to flow somewhere else. And so the more wetlands that you take away, there's kind of more water that doesn't have necessarily a place to go. And you can imagine that in a flood situation, all of that water is just kind of going to pool up and flow across the surface of the landscape. So droughts is kind of a similar concept. Wetlands hold onto water and help distribute it more evenly across watersheds. And then this improves water availability because when water is limited by factors such as droughts, there's more access to water at different locations. And wetlands become very important water sources when water availability is limited. So again, you can kind of see from this picture that having wetlands distributed across the landscape, you have water more evenly distributed across the landscape. And wetlands are kind of one of the last points of land that when water is limited, they hold on to water for the longest. So you can kind of think of wetlands as a sponge. And so when you have floods or really wet conditions, they work as a sponge to collect and absorb excess water. And then they're really, really good at holding on to this water. So then when you have droughts and water is limited and not available, you can kind of, like a sponge, squeeze out the last remaining bits of water from the wetland. So environmental benefits of wetlands with regards to water regulation is that they hold on to and distribute water across watersheds. And for agricultural benefits, wetlands buffer the impacts of floods and droughts on crop production, and then they reduce the costs associated with flood and drought damages. The stewardship recommendations are pretty straightforward, just to keep intact wetlands in order to reduce the severity of flood and drought damages. So the next ecological service I'm going to talk about is water filtration. Wetlands are points on the landscape where runoff gathers before this runoff enters larger water bodies and the rest of the watershed. And so because the wetlands collect and gather runoff, they are important points of water filtration. Wetlands are able to filter out nutrients, pesticides, and sediments. So for wetlands, the filtration actually occurs in the vegetative filter strip, and vegetative filter strip refers to the area between a body of water and cropland or other land use that's composed of native vegetation like grasses, trees, or shrubs. So at the bottom, there's a picture, kind of like a little diagram, and you can see that there's a water body, and then there's like a 20-meter strip of permanent vegetation that separates the water body from where the land is being cropped. And so vegetative filter strips essentially slow runoff before it enters from the agricultural landscape into the wetland, and this prevents contaminants from entering water bodies. And how the vegetation does this is by allowing suspended particles to settle, as well as sometimes the vegetation will take up these particles. So here are some pictures of vegetative filter strips. On the picture on the left, you have a residential wetland, and you can kind of clearly see how you have the recreational land use and then this very thick vegetation layer and then the water. And so any runoff coming across the land is going to have to pass through that dense vegetation where there's a lot of opportunity for any kind of contaminants to be filtered out. The picture on the right shows something similar on an agricultural landscape. If you look around the edge of the water, you will see kind of a bright green border of natural vegetation, and it's not super wide in this diagram, but you can see how you still have that layer of vegetation separating the water from the land that's being cropped. So with regards to nutrient removal, vegetative buffer strips are able to prevent fertilizer and the nitrogen essentially that's in the fertilizer from entering bodies of water. And this is important because nitrogen and fertilizer can result in eutrophication and algal blooms, which contaminates drinking water and has huge consequences for aquatic ecosystems. This diagram shows an algal bloom of a wetland, and you can see the water is very gross, and I think there's a lot more awareness of eutrophication now, and so there's a lot of things in place to prevent this from happening. But when excess nitrogen does enter aquatic ecosystems, there are huge health risks that are associated with that. And so vegetative filter strips prevent this nitrogen and runoff from entering water bodies because in a couple of different ways. One is that it's kind of a second stop where plants can uptake this nitrogen and use it for their own growth. It's kind of the same reason you would apply nitrogen fertilizer to your cropland for the plants to take it up. And if for some reason this fertilizer is carried off with runoff towards a water body, having a vegetative buffer strip is a kind of second stop for plants to take up this excess nitrogen. And as well, just slowing down the speed of runoff can allow denitrification to transform this nitrogen before it enters water bodies and causes eutrophication. So filter strips are also effective at pesticide removal, and they're able to remove both particle-bound and soluble pesticides from runoff. However, pesticides that adsorb to soil particles are most effectively filtered out by filter strips. So this would be like glyphosate, for example. And so typically pesticide products will require having a filter strip in place when you use them, and 10 meters is kind of a common distance, but different pesticide labels have different recommendations. And so it's always important to look at the products that you're using to know how much vegetation is recommended between a body of water and where you are using the pesticide. So for environmental benefits, wetlands maintain watershed quality by improving drinking water quality and improving aquatic ecosystem health. And for agricultural benefits, wetlands contribute to responsible product use by making sure that things like fertilizers and pesticides aren't unintentionally entering watersheds through wetlands. And this is important because I know there's a lot of restrictions and regulations regarding products that are used for agriculture. So making sure, kind of having this extra buffer to make sure that there aren't any adverse environmental impacts of these products can be important for allowing continued use of these products without further imposed restrictions on them. For stewardship recommendations, the first is to not apply fertilizer, pesticide, or any other product directly to wetlands, even when they're dry. And I know a lot of these recommendations are pretty obvious and things that you would probably never do, but it's just important to remember, especially when wetlands are dry, if you are cropping a dry wetland and spraying products on it, when this land fills up with water in a wet year, that can put that water body at risk of contaminants from products. It's also recommended to maintain a 10-meter vegetative filter strip around wetlands or other distance as specified by different product labels. And even if you're not using pesticides, this vegetative filter strip can help kind of just filter out anything from sediments, reducing erosion, and reducing nitrogen loading. And it's also recommended to establish healthy, diverse native vegetation in filter strips. So the more diverse the filter strip is with different plants and the more dense it is, the more effective it will be at filtering out different contaminants and uptaking excess nitrogen. And then it's also recommended to occasionally mow filter strips. And so what this does is if you were kind of taking care of the vegetation and mowing it, it allows for continued growth and continued things like nitrogen and fertilizer uptake. So the last ecosystem service I'm going to go over today is biodiversity. And wetlands maintain biodiversity by providing habitat for diverse species. So this includes species at risk that are federally listed as endangered or threatened. This includes game species, so for hunting and recreation, as well as insects that can be beneficial for agriculture. So I'll begin by talking about species at risk, and particularly birds. There are approximately 120 species of birds that are wetland dependent. And of these 120 species, 17 of them are federally listed as threatened or endangered. And so a lot of wetlands provide essential bird breeding habitat, and many migratory birds are dependent on wetlands to refuel and for feeding and for breeding. And so you can imagine, as I said earlier, that only about 30% of historic wetlands are intact. And so having only 30% of your natural habitat would have huge consequences for populations of species that rely on this habitat. And so in the bottom here, on the left, we have a picture of a piping plover, which is federally listed as endangered. And on the right, we have a whooping crane, which is also federally listed as endangered. And wetland conservation as well as restoration are critical parts of management plans for helping species at risk recover. So wetlands also provide beneficial insect habitat. And so some beneficial insects for agriculture include pollinators, which of course are essential for crops that are insect pollinated like canola and some pulses. And then wetlands also provide habitat for parasitoid predator insects. So this refers to insects that predate on pest insects. And so parasitoid predator insects can be very beneficial for agriculture by acting as kind of natural pest control systems. On the bottom on the left is a picture of a ground beetle, and ground beetles that are native to Alberta actually predate on pea leaf weevils, and pea leaf weevils are a huge agricultural pest. So kind of having habitat that promotes ground beetles can help to keep populations of things like pea leaf weevils low through natural control methods. And then on the right, there's a picture of a pollinator pollinating canola. And again, having these habitats that provide nesting habitats and draw in pollinators on agricultural landscapes can help improve pollination. So overall, incorporating natural habitats like wetlands can work to improve crop yields by increasing the abundance of beneficial insects. So I'm going to share a couple different studies that demonstrate how wetlands can affect insect populations as well as agriculture. So this study, conducted in 2006, looked at how natural habitats impact pollinator populations on agricultural landscape. And so this particular study looked at canola fields, and on the x-axis here and along the bottom, it shows the amount of uncultivated land. So this would be natural habitats, including wetlands. And then on the top, on the y-axis going up, we have bee abundance. And so from the study, it was found that as there are increases in uncultivated land within field edges of agricultural landscapes, it relates to a direct increase in bee abundance for canola fields. And so ultimately, this study demonstrates that incorporating uncultivated land like wetlands in agricultural landscapes increases pollinator abundance. And by increasing pollinators, natural habitats can improve the crop yield per hectare. So here's another study that kind of looked again at the benefits of natural habitats like wetlands for agricultural production. So there's 4 different maps that show canola, barley, wheat, and oat. And for each of these maps, in each scenario, they reallocated 1% of land within an agricultural region to non-crop land. So this would be like natural habitats again, like wetlands and other kind of natural areas. And then when they redistributed 1% of this land to non-crop land cover, they looked at how this affected yield for each of these different crops. And so the bar on the right shows proportional increases in yield from 0 to 0.05%. And you can see from canola, it's about a 0.02% increase in crop yield per hectare. And with the wheat and the oat, it gets up to 0.05% increase in yield. And the barley was pretty unaffected. It either didn't increase or increase up to 0.01%. But what this study really shows that's important is that in all of these cases, they are taking 1% of the land out of production. So they're removing it from growing crops and they're converting it to a natural habitat. And of the overall landscape, it's not actually reducing the total crop produced. And in some cases, it's actually increasing crop yield. So if you go back and think about the opportunity cost of wetlands and how often if you have wetlands, it can be like a burden because you can't crop that land. The study shows that actually maintaining wetlands at this rate of 1% doesn't even take away from your total production, and in some cases increases it. Okay, so onto the environmental benefits. Wetlands provide essential habitat for diverse wildlife, including species at risk. And for agricultural benefits, wetlands provide habitat for beneficial insect species, including pollinators and parasitoid predator insects. Incorporating wetlands on agricultural landscapes can increase the yield per hectare of insect-pollinated crops. So for stewardship recommendations, again, it's kind of always the same, but incorporating wetlands throughout agricultural landscapes is important. And in this case, it will increase pollinator abundance and diversity, as well as providing habitat for other beneficial insects. It's also recommended to maintain, again, a vegetative filtership with diverse native vegetation. So oftentimes with pollinators, they're kind of drawn into wetlands because there is that source of water, but they're going to kind of build their nests in the vegetation surrounding wetlands. So again, having a healthy vegetative filtership around a wetland is an important part of wetland management. So that concludes the ecological services provided by wetlands, and I'm going to wrap up the webinar with a brief summary. So to reiterate the benefits of wetlands for agriculture, with regards to carbon sequestration, there is opportunity to implement policy that compensates landowners for the carbon that is sequestered and stored by wetlands on their land. With regard to the progression of climate change and increases in severe flood and drought events, wetlands are essential for adapting agricultural landscapes to these weather events and reducing the costs of flood and drought damages. Wetlands also ensure responsible water stewardship, and use of pesticides and fertilizers can continue to occur without increased restrictions. And lastly, wetlands increase the abundance and diversity of beneficial insects like pollinators, which increases a yield per hectare of insect-pollinated crops. So again, kind of the wetland stewardship recommendations that are, again, they're pretty straightforward, but I just think it's important to remember conserving and restoring wetlands are extremely important. When you're conserving them, you are conserving the carbon stores in the ground, you are conserving habitat for endangered species, And when you restore wetlands, you are doing things like increasing carbon storage on prairie landscapes and increasing habitat. And again, the one study that I talked about just looked at converting 1% of land cover on an agricultural field to wetlands and showed that that did have positive impacts on the agricultural production side. And so it's not like transforming your entire land to wetlands, or even just in small amounts, wetland restoration can be very beneficial. Again, it's recommended to not crop wetlands, even when they're dry. This is important for maintaining the carbon stores in the ground and making sure that pesticides aren't going to enter these parts of land when they do fill up with water. And lastly, it's important to maintain healthy vegetative buffer strips around wetlands that are composed of diverse native vegetation. Having these buffer strips helps filter water, prevents erosion, and also these filter strips are going to be kind of the area that's going to provide habitat for things like beneficial insects and a lot of different animal species. So there are two main takeaways that I want everyone to remember from this webinar. And the first is that wetlands are very dynamic and diverse ecosystems. So each wetland is unique, and the characteristics of a wetland constantly change with the surrounding environment. And this is really important because this kind of means that wetlands will provide different benefits and services. And because wetlands are so dynamic and complex, it's difficult to predict or to kind of quantify the benefits of wetlands in general. And this kind of is what makes policy so tricky. You know, you can't just look at, it's hard to just look at one wetland and say that it will sequester this amount of carbon, or looking at another wetland saying, oh, but it's emitting methane, so it's actually contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. It's just a lot more complicated than that, and you really need to take each wetland into consideration with the bigger picture on a landscape scale. And then the second takeaway is that incorporating wetlands on agricultural landscapes is not necessarily a direct profit loss. And so while wetlands do reduce the number of acres that can be cropped, and they pose challenges with regards to having to crop around the edges of wetlands, they also do provide economic benefits. And so, like I mentioned, they can provide huge cost savings when you do have flood and drought damages. They can also increase the yield per hectare of your remaining acres that are in production by improving things like pollination. And so it's kind of a bit abstract to compare the economic benefits of wetlands to the kind of clear costs of reducing the land. But yeah, ultimately, wetlands are not always opportunity costs and can work to improve agricultural practices and production. Yeah, so that wraps up my webinars. And if anyone has any questions, you can put in the chat or question box and I can answer those. I think there's no questions so far. Is that correct, Rhonda?
Hi, Hayley. I don't see any questions yet. I just typed in the chat that if anybody had any questions, they could type them in. I see a question coming in from Nevin. The one question from Nevin is, it's a multiple question, so I guess I'll start with the beginning part. He asks, regarding vegetative filter strips, the 20 m example seems excessive for all wetlands. Is there a minimum VFS distance?
Yeah, the 20 meters is definitely a bit excessive. I definitely should have mentioned that. That was kind of just an image that I grabbed from the internet, kind of just as an example. And so a lot of different pesticide labels will have minimums recommended that can be as little as 3 to 5 meters. If you go and look at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's website, they kind of recommend 10 meters unless otherwise specified by a specific product. So it is highly variable, but it's very rare that any kind of product would require a 20-meter filter strip.
Thank you, Hayley. And this is a two-part question. So the second part is, could there be policies to increase the VFS to compensate farmers to retain an ample VFS?
So it's asking if there could be policies
to increase the VFS to compensate farmers to retain the ample VFS. Seems like a hard question.
Yeah, okay. I think what you're asking, correct me if I'm wrong, is if farmers can be compensated if policy asks them to have larger vegetative filter strips for the ecological benefits. And I think, yeah, if that's the question, I think that does kind of get into kind of some tricky topics with regards to ecological services. So vegetative filter strips do provide really important ecological services with regards to water filtration that impact everyone, not just farmers and not just agricultural landscapes, because water is so interconnected. Maintaining water quality in one local area can affect an entire watershed. And so a lot of things like ecological services like wetlands, having a wetland on your land kind of is a burden to you, but provides ecological services for, it could be like people many kilometers away. It can be very beneficial for like entire towns, and you're kind of the only person who takes the burden because it's your wetland. And so there is kind of a lot of discussion of how you can kind of put like an economic benefit on things like a wetland and the ecological services they provide, and kind of, you know, who kind of takes the costs and who benefits from it. But it's a very challenging topic that I think, especially with environmental policy for a lot of different things, that's being discussed a lot right now.
Hello, Hayley. I have one other question. What research is needed to establish a better understanding of the carbon and methane cycles? And to that point, is it better to retain larger wetlands or ephemerals on the landscape?
So that's a good question. And I think with regards to research deficits, I think there's like a pretty good understanding of the carbon and the methane cycle. And I would say the research gap almost is how you can predict it from a specific wetland or easily measure it. Just because if you go to a certain wetland and you set up the different gas monitoring tools and devices and you measure the different emissions over a period of time, that's a lot of work and kind of almost only relevant to that one specific wetland. And so I think it's like very challenging, but trying to kind of create maybe models or things that can almost predict or give a good understanding in a much more simplified, shorter period of time of just kind of different general wetlands based on specific features, what kind of greenhouse gases they might emit, or, you know, how quickly they're sequestering carbon, things like that. And then with regards to wetlands and methane emissions, it's kind of an interesting question. So typically like a semi-permanent or a permanent wetland that's saturated with water for long periods of time would be expected to have higher methane emissions than an ephemeral wetland. However, if like a lot of permanent wetlands in Alberta are fed groundwater, and if this groundwater is high in sulfate, then you wouldn't expect to see like really any methane emissions from a wetland that's high in sulfate. So having kind of a semi-permanent, permanent wetland, it can have a lot of methane production, but only if it's not being fed high salinity groundwater. And so it's kind of hard to say like you should just keep a permanent wetland or you should just keep an ephemeral wetland. And again, that's only kind of looking at one small picture. If your objective was only methane emissions and trying to prevent methane emissions, you'd probably want to keep ephemeral wetlands. But then also keeping in mind that ephemeral wetlands are known to have more nitrous oxide production, and different wetlands also provide different kind of benefits for other things. So different water filtration capacity, habitat for different species, not all different birds prefer permanent wetlands, some actually prefer ephemeral wetlands. So different wetlands definitely kind of have different costs and benefits associated with them. And so from my opinion, I think it's good to keep kind of like a diverse amount of wetlands instead of kind of targeting only conserving or restoring a certain type of wetland, and rather kind of like, I think it's important to keep semi-permanent wetlands as well as ephemeral wetlands that are kind of diverse so that you do have the different benefits from all of them.
Thank you, Hayley. I'm going to give you the next question. The next question is, for the 1% retention of wetlands showing yield benefit, is there a key contributor to the yields benefit that can be identified? And is it the presence of pollinators? Is it a combination of all effects?
So in that particular study, they were kind of like generally looking at just the proportion of converting 1% of land to non-crop cover and not a specific factor, but definitely in the discussion, pollinators was kind of thought of as like a big contributor, especially for insect pollinated crops, and that's kind of paired with other studies that show that having kind of like increased pollinators does improve the yield per hectare of crops. But again, I think there are kind of like a wide range of benefits. So it might even be things like kind of like buffering the effects of other environmental things like droughts and floods and wind, and just kind of having like natural habitats incorporated does provide a lot of different ecological services that, again, can improve agriculture. But yeah, in that particular study, there was kind of a discussion looking at different reasons, but they didn't identify like a specific one that drove it in that study.
Thank you, Hayley. The next question is, thank you for the presentation. When would you recommend mowing a VFS? Is there a habitat for birds, bees, etc.? Would this not be disruptive? Question mark.
That is, yeah, a good question, and definitely time of year would matter. So it's important not to do that, I would say, during breeding season, which would be in the spring for birds. I think there is a guide on AAFC's website, and I think it's kind of like towards the end of the growing season is when it would be recommended to mow this. So then for the next growing season, you do have a lot of potential for new continued plant growth. But yeah, again, if you are mowing this natural habitat in like breeding season, especially for birds in the spring, that's a really good point that could be not ideal for ecological benefits.
Okay, Hayley, sounds like you're ready for the next question. We have two more. The next one is, are tools such as sensors being developed in order for landowners to monitor ongoing carbon emissions or sequestrations? I don't like models.
Yeah, I think, yeah, models are definitely not ideal because, again, it's just a model. And so I think like there's so much research kind of going into this, how you can quantify, because most of the research that exists right now, which there is a lot, it is pretty much all models, or and the models are based off of going to wetlands and taking measurements. However, again, it is really complicated just because trying to like monitor this is like can be very expensive, and it happens over a long period of time. And I think like there are things like gas chambers that I think like if you're just interested as a landowner, I think they're quite expensive, but you could purchase and like monitor it and kind of do your own research. And I think there is a lot of research kind of being done to look at like simple ways to be able to assess how wetlands can sequester carbon and how this offsets emissions. But to my understanding right now, there's nothing as easy as just landowners being able to kind of pick something up and measure their own carbon sequestration right now.
Great answer, Hayley. Next one is, could you describe the incentives available to landowners for wetland restoration?
So that's a good question, and I'm not entirely certain on current incentives. I know that like organizations like Ducks Unlimited, or like I know, for example, if you are a construction company and if you include wetlands on your land in your construction plans, you do get kind of like reduced costs. So there is definitely policy incentives in place. I'm not sure exactly what they are for landowners if you restore it right now. Like you're not really recognized for a lot of the public goods and services that wetlands provide, but that's definitely something that like kind of going forward, like recognizing like carbon storage and like endangered species habitats that I think landowners should absolutely be recognized for if they are restoring wetlands on their land.
Fabulous, Hayley, and it looks like this is the last question. What is the legal definition of a wetland, both created or removed?
So the legal definition of a wetland is kind of what I went over at the beginning. So it is land that has been altered by water to form soil and vegetation and biotic processes that are characteristic of having water for a long period of time. So again, kind of referring to wetlands, even when water's not there, if it does have the characteristic soil. And usually when you talk about characteristic soil, it would have kind of signs of anaerobic activity. And often, if you look at wetland soil, it'll be like a very kind of bluey, silvery gray color, which is the result of kind of iron being reduced over time because there's no oxygen available to it for the long inundation periods. Or you might see, if you have a dry wetland, like a lot of kind of models of rust colored things in the soil. And so this is kind of iron that's been translocated in wet periods of time. The iron translocates into these clumps. And so it's kind of looking at the soil properties, and the most easy way that kind of if you have people doing like wetland permitting or people going to your land to assess wetlands would be looking at the vegetation. So there's kind of key wetland species like sedges that if they're present, that indicates that that land is a wetland, even if there's water there or not. And then, so once the wetland's like destroyed, the land would not be a wetland anymore. But if the land, like if it's a wetland that's dry, it is still a wetland. I think that answers that question.
Great, Hayley. Last 3 minutes, there's just one more comment. Comment, not a question. DUC pays landowners fair market value for restoration of drained wetlands, compensating for the restored ecosystem services. So last 3 minutes, do you have any final comments for the audience?
No, I'd like to thank everyone for joining, and I hope that everyone has a bit of appreciation for wetlands, as annoying as they can be at times. And yeah.
Looks like we might have time for another question. I see one more came in. How long would it take to restore a wetland, and what is a typical process?
So restoring wetlands is actually pretty straightforward. It usually just involves, well, when I say it's straightforward for prairie wetlands, it's pretty straightforward, kind of creating a depression in the ground that's naturally going to fill up with water. And it really doesn't take long, but you know, in order for like the altered soil and vegetation to establish, that can take a couple years. And one particular study that I didn't talk about in this presentation, but it looked at kind of like when you restore a wetland, how fast can it kind of sequester carbon? And it showed that within about 3 years of being established, wetlands are able to pretty rapidly sequester carbon at kind of rates similar to pre-disturbance wetlands.
Well, thank you so much, Hayley. It looks like our time is up. It is now 1 o'clock.
Awesome, thank you.
Bye, everybody.